I read 16 books in the last 2 months, which I'm pretty pleased with. Let's talk about them in my flamingo blanket. Hello, thank you for being here. My name is Chloe. Welcome to Recovering Book Snob, where we read books for fun. And reading books for fun means, for me at least, that I read a huge range of genres and I'm constantly trying out new ones, which is proven in this list because there is serious range in these 16 books and I'm proud of it. This is also in chronological order. So let's rewind, let's hark back to the beginning of April when I read Come and Get It by Kiley Reid. I read Such a Fun Age a while ago now and I really enjoyed it. So when I saw that Kiley Reid was releasing another book, I was pretty keen to get my grubby mitts on it. And not gonna lie, I was a little bit disappointed. So it wasn't a great start. Come and Get It is about a residential assistant and her affair with a professor, and also just her dealings with a few of the students that she's a residential assistant for. I really liked the premise. Like when I started reading the book, I really felt semi-confident, or I was quietly hopeful that it would be a corker and that I'd love it, especially because there are quite a few characters and they are all very morally grey. Everyone's kind of dodgy in their own way, but you do also empathise with them, and that's great. That's a lot of fun, and I tend to quite like kind of stories that are more character driven. They don't really need a great plot. I like just learning about the people. Unfortunately, this book just fell short. I think there were a few too many characters and that balance wasn't really struck, so it didn't feel like the characters were explored with enough depth. And for me, that means that people start to behave in ways that don't make sense, and it kind of just feels like they're doing a certain thing for the drama. Not having that deeper understanding of a character makes a lot of the plot points kind of meaningless for me. I don't know how I've got this perfectly horizontal piece of hair, but we're gonna ignore it. And yeah, it also meant that whenever we had a build of momentum, we'd suddenly shift our perspective, we'd suddenly start looking at another person's story, and that was just frustrating. You thought you were about to reach a really intriguing climax and then suddenly you'd start learning about a character that you don't really care about. I think sometimes that's a really good way to have little release points in a book, but too much and you just end up constantly disappointed, frustrated. I think the way I summarised it when I reviewed it on Goodreads, which you can follow me there if you want, is I said overall a pleasant but dissatisfying read. And I gave it 3 stars, but that was a rounded up 2.5. So next up, I'm trying to get more into non-fiction, and I read Invisible Woman, which is a really famous book, famous to me at least. A lot of people were talking about this, a lot of people recommended it to me, and I really enjoyed it. It's about how a gender gap in data perpetuates bias and disadvantages women. And it talks about so many things. It is chock full of examples. She came with receipts. Examples that you might recognise actually that come from this book, or at least are included in this book. And it's also pretty compelling for non-fiction, but I did find it quite depressing. So, I don't know, maybe give it a read when you feel like you've got a few spoons to give. Next up, and I picked this up as an audiobook at the library, so you know it's going to be random when it's an audiobook at the library, in 1,000 different ways. So this is about the life of Alice from childhood to older age, and Alice has a gift. That gift is that she can see people's emotions as colourful clouds around them. So I guess it's fantasy, and it was a really lovely story. The characters felt very, very real. It had some really sweet messages sprinkled in. The pacing was a bit weird. I haven't really thought about it since I read it, so it didn't completely blow my mind, but it was sweet and it was easy to read. And there you have it. Next up, Catch It in the Rye. It's by quite an indie author. You might not have heard of him. I think I did read this book ages ago when I was younger. It's 2 days in the life of a 16-year-old called Holden Caulfield who's just been expelled from school, and he's a little bit fancies himself as a bit of a gift of the gab, charming young lad. I don't personally think he really is. It's really well written, it's stunning, I absolutely get it, and Holden, our main character, is a nightmare, a nightmare person, and I was really shocked at how much people hate him. When I was reading reviews and when I was kind of looking, I got quite deep into Catcher in the Rye character analyses and Catcher in the Rye comment threads and discussion groups, and people really don't like Holden, but I feel that we're forgetting his age when we criticize him, and we're forgetting what he's going through. I do think he's pretty dodgy, but I also think he's a selfish, insecure child, and he gets more heat than he deserves, maybe. Boy Parts by Eliza Clark. Irina takes photographs. She's an artiste, and she takes photographs of boys, explicit photographs, and puts them on her site, and that's her whole shtick. She's extremely self-destructive and destructive in general, and has just been offered a really big gig in London. This book is mostly based in Newcastle. She's from Newcastle, but the glitz and the glam of the capital city calls. She's offered this gig, and this book follows kind of the build-up to this gig, from the offer to, I keep saying gig, I'm trying to be hip, I don't know if gig is the right word. She's offered like a space within an exhibition, and this offer sort of triggers a spiral. I promise I'm not going to spoil this book, but let me just say that I had no idea what I was getting myself in for. I don't know how it was described when I first looked into it, but I think it's meant to be like kind of year of rest and relaxation, that genre, and I have to say it is a lot darker. It's very smart and creepy and memorable, and I kind of finished it feeling like I did get it and I did sort of enjoy it, but I also hated the main character too much to enthusiastically recommend it. She's really, really horrible, extremely self-obsessed, and absolutely ghastly to her roommates. Just cruel person. And I kind of, sometimes when I think a character is really cruel, and especially when I feel like they're very self-obsessed and cruel, I almost don't like giving them the attention. I'm like, they don't deserve me reading their story, even though they're fictional. So yeah, that's how I felt about Boy Parts. Men I've Loved Before by Adele Parks. I've already ranted about this book so many times to so many of my friends, so I actually am gonna try and keep this short because I've exhausted myself. I picked this book up from the library. It's an audiobook, so another one where I had no idea. Sorry, Matty came home, so I was interrupted. Where was I? This is about a couple in their early 30s. They've always agreed that they don't want kids. He changes his mind, which is obviously fine. People can change their minds. And he asks her, in a very inappropriate setting, if she would like to change her mind with him, if you know what I mean. And it goes from there. There's a lot of friction because she's like, no, I actually still don't want kids. And instead of just having any kind of ounce of empathy and kind of emotional intelligence, he just starts this weird campaign to try to persuade her that actually she really does want kids. So things like, he says to his brother that he'll babysit his kids without warning. So she thinks that she's staying at the brother's as a fun weekend getaway. They get there and the kids are still there, and he's like, oh, but we can see what it's like to have kids and you'll be convinced that kids are great and like we'll be great parents and you'll be a great mom and all this. So there's that going on. Weird. But by this point in the book I still wasn't really sure what we were dealing with. I was like, well, it kind of depends how it ties up. Maybe he's in for a bit of a positive character arc. Maybe this is just leaving space for growth. And it just goes so badly downhill. The way that it's resolved, so she sleeps with his best friend, which was weird in its, sorry, I'm spoiling this book because I don't want anyone to read it. She sleeps with his best friend, which is weird anyway. Like, it started to feel like bad writing. It's very not in line with her personality. And then she finds out she's pregnant. But meanwhile, he, the husband, recently also pinned a hole in the condom, which I read that and I was like, I think that might be a crime. I think that's a sexual crime. He admits that he poked a hole in the condom. She immediately forgives him. She keeps the baby. They live happily ever after. Next up, what I talk about when I talk about running. This is a Murakami book, my first Murakami book. This book is a memoir. He writes about his interest in running, getting into running, the build up to kind of long distance races and his experience racing these races. I actually found it to be more memoir than I anticipated. I thought it would be not self-helpy, but I thought the focus would be more on running than it was. There were some nice little bits of memoir in there that I enjoyed and kind of was surprised by. Quite cool. I listened to this as an audiobook while running 32 kilometers, which was my longest training run before running a marathon. But yeah, I enjoyed it. Conversational tone, it was kind of chatty but wise. You could tell he's an excellent author. There was a bit of misogyny in there, but because I was kind of ready for it, I shrugged it off, and overall I quite enjoyed the book. The Stand by Stephen King. I did a long video on this. This was a big scary book club book because this book was over 1,300 pages. I actually thought it was 1,000 pages, and I think the usual edition is, but I accidentally picked up the extended edition, which is 300 extra pages, which amuses me because 300 pages is the length of a book. So having an extra book's length in a book kind of made me extra scared. But yeah, this was my first Stephen King. It's about a deadly pandemic that wipes out 99% of people. And so the first half is kind of about that, about this apocalypse. And then the second half, we start to move more into looking at the survivors of this pandemic, and how some gravitate towards good, some towards evil. You end up with a little bit of supernatural. The first 400 pages, so the kind of outbreak, were extraordinary. You need to watch my vlog if you're remotely interested, because I talked quite a lot about what I enjoyed about those pages, and why they were just so, like, I don't think I've ever read a book and had such a visceral response while reading. Really, really incredible. And then after that, as it slowly moves into the supernatural, as it slowly starts to become this good evil question, I didn't enjoy it quite as much, but the first bit was so good and the next bit was still really, really excellent. The book was still a 5-star read overall for me. So yeah, exceptionally exceptional, exception. What a great time. Funny Story by Emily Henry. I think this is her latest release. I think this is pretty hot off the press. The premise is great. Peter, let's follow. There are, okay, 4 main people really, if you think about it. Peter is engaged to Daphne. Peter has a best friend, and that best friend has a boyfriend. Peter, on his stag night, gets with his best friend, who's got the boyfriend, and obviously Peter's engaged to Daphne, and leaves Daphne the next morning for his best friend. So Peter and the best friend go off together. Daphne, who was living with Peter at the time, hasn't got anywhere to live. The only other person that she kind of knows in this town that she moved to for Peter is Peter's best friend's now ex, Miles. Is he called Miles? So Daphne moves in with Miles while they are both heartbroken because their exes have respectively run off with each other. Amazing. I really enjoyed it. It was another, I think I put in my review, Emily Henry strikes again. It was warm, the characters were lovely. I think sometimes with romances, the men are sort of low-key the worst. Like, they're meant to be these brooding hotties, but they're kind of just red flags, and I don't like it. I want a slightly more rounded guy. And Miles is that, you know, he's got his things, but he's overall really lovely, so I appreciated that. And this book is just top of my list for romance recommendations. So Either Or by Elif Bautman. This is the sequel to The Idiot. It's about Selin, who is a sophomore studying literature at Harvard in 1996. So a lot of the book and a lot of the book that came before focuses around like email communication, which is a fun little detail. But other than that, this book epitomizes the no plot, just vibes type story. It's definitely kind of about womanhood and coming of age, but I'm in love with this book. I think I possibly loved it even more than the first one, which I really loved as well. A lot of love going around, because I just feel like we saw more character development from Selin. Some of the loose ends from the first one felt like they were really tied up in this one, and it's very unpredictable, but in the way that life is unpredictable, so it kind of maintains a you know, it feels very realistic. The Lido by Libby Page. This book disappointed me, I'm afraid, about Rosemary and Kate. Rosemary is an 80-something-year-old widow. Kate is a 26-year-old journalist who's a bit lost in life. She's a bit hectic. She needs to slow down, but she's not. And they come together to fight for Brixton's Lido, the Lido in Brockwell Park that exists. So it's based around like a place I'm familiar with, which is kind of fun. And I read it because I was on holiday with my friend and my friend had it. And she hadn't read it yet, but she was like, oh, I've got this book, give it a read. Yeah, as I said, it was sweet, but I just don't think it was much more than that. The plot was just very predictable. The characters were kind of simple, and I enjoyed like seeing an area I'm familiar with written about, but yeah, beyond that I felt nothing. Kitchen by Banana Yoshimoto. This is about grief mostly. Yeah, it's mostly about grief. It's also a bit about food, which are like my two favourite subjects. So this is about Mikage, who is overcoming or trying to overcome the death of her grandmother. While doing this, she kind of becomes closer and closer to one of her grandmother's friends, and she stays with him and his mum. It's a kind of unpredictable, slightly strange, really beautiful story. It definitely reads like poetry. It's definitely one of those where you kind of need to just let yourself drift off and be taken away in the tide of funky writing. But don't let that fool you, because it's not complicated. Like, the sentences are all very simple, the language is all very simple. So that's kind of interesting, because it's very deep, but it's not hard to follow. Burning Questions by Margret Atwood. I haven't read any books from her that like aren't extremely smart, and this essay collection is. I think it's one of those things I'm gonna reread it when I'm a bit older, and I think I'm gonna have it in physical form, because reading all essays one after the other as opposed to like dipping in and out of this book that's on your nightstand is not the right thing to do. Some of the essays were just completely dazzling. I felt like they felt like perfect reads, and then others I felt nothing, and I just felt like the wrong audience. I really just didn't get it. My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. I was gifted this book by a friend of mine, so that was kind of funny, because it was like, what are you trying to say? because it's about two girls growing up together and their friendship, but also their rivalry. Specifically, they have quite an intense academic rivalry, which like me and this friend kind of had. I definitely wouldn't describe it as a rivalry, but we were definitely like nerds together. So this was a funny one to get. Like there were moments where I was like, oh my god, is she trying to send a message? So yeah, it's about these two girls growing up in a very poor neighborhood in Naples. It is about their friendship, but it's also about the community that surrounds them, and it is just beautiful, really beautiful, very complex, a really easy read. Like I was captivated. It got a bit slow in the final third. I also feel like I didn't, because it's written from the one girl's point of view, I feel like the other girl, her character there was a limit to how much you could understand about her character, which was almost certainly intentional, but I found that quite frustrating to read. And it meant that by the end, she felt like a bit of just like a two-dimensional, really smart girl. And it was like, what else? Still extraordinary, still 5 stars. It's actually the first book of a series, so I'm definitely gonna read the next books. So I'll check back in when I have. Next up, another one that you might have heard of, 1984 by George Orwell. Crazy book. I tried to read this, I think when I was really young, when I was a bit too young, and so it made me apprehensive to try and read it again, because I remember just being very uninterested. I honestly think even just the title being a date made me think like, oh, is this some kind of really complicated like political history thing? Like that's what I had in my head. And I mean, it kind of is, but really not in the way that younger me feared. We have our main character, Winston Smith, who lives in Oceania, which is a place where the party is always watching. There is no individuality, but Winston is pretty sick of it and ends up pursuing a relationship with Julia, which is like kind of not allowed, informally not allowed. I loved the opening of this book. Like I really loved the first third, but then I ended it at a slightly lower point than when I started. It's crazy. It's a crazy, like very thought-provoking. I get it. I'm not a hater. Don't come after me, 1984 fans. But I found the characters kind of meh, and the story arc was like a bit harrowing. And that was the main emotion I had. Like it was just quite harrowing. And I think that you can have a bit of harrow in there. Like not everything has to be sunshine and roses, but I want to finish a book with more than just one super dominant emotion like that. But no, I was really struck by the detail, and there's loads of information about language in the kind of post-book section as well. It talks loads about the language of that world, and I thought that was really cool. Finally, we have Buried in the Sky. This book is another non-fiction, we're getting into it, about a disaster on K2 in 2008, August 2008, where 11 climbers died and 2 Sherpas survived. So K2 is not as tall, not as high. They mean different things, I know, but I can't remember the right word. Anyway, it's not like Everest is the big one, but K2 is far more dangerous. And on this one climb in particular, so many people died. So it's kind of the story of that climb, but it really focuses on the Sherpas. And it's written by 2 journalists who did a ton of research. And that really comes through. Like, I think it's hard enough to cobble together a story from a disaster like this, where not only is it loads of people's memories conflicting, and also obviously some people's memories that you can't access because they died, but it's also just like people aren't going to remember things that accurately. So that really struck me. I was like, wow, this is incredible work, just putting together this story. But the real skill, I thought, was in the way a level of empathy was maintained, even though It was clear that the book was trying to shed a little bit of light on how Sherpas are just massively undervalued, about a lot of the exploitative practices that happen with high altitude mountaineering and the relationships that climbers have with Sherpas. But equally, it felt like every individual that was in the story was given a kind of fair hearing, and there was a lot of questions raised, a lot of criticism of mountaineering. It reflects on how high altitude mountaineering is this bizarre, lethal, kind of selfish sport, but at no point does it feel like it's like pushing any kind of agenda. So yeah, very smart writing. And I'm also not at all into climbing, but it's very accessible. Overall, I loved this book. It was crazy. It's so good, so gripping. The first half, we're being introduced to the two main Sherpas, Cheering and Pasang, and we're hearing about their lives. And then the second half really focuses on, you know, step by step, what led to disaster, like really looking at that whole climb, that series of days. And then there's a little bit at the end that talks about the aftermath a little bit, which is really interesting as well. But especially the description of the step-by-step, the climb, I really couldn't put this book down. So good. So yeah, that's what I've been up to these past 2 months. Thank you for watching. I hope you've had a good weekend. I hope you've had a good 2 months of reading, like I have. I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.